Take a moment, because what you're about to hear isn't just another policy update. It's something that could directly change how, where, and even if you can legally carry a firearm without you ever intending to break the law. Imagine this. You're following the rules. You're carrying responsibly. You believe you understand your rights. Then a proposal moves forward, not in a way that feels dramatic, not in a way that immediately reaches everyone, but in a way that quietly redraws the line between what is legal and what is not. And suddenly, the difference between being compliant and being at risk may come down to details you never fully realized had changed. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. Do you think expanding no-carry zones actually improves public safety? Or does it create confusion for lawful gun owners trying to follow the law? Take a second and share your view, because this is a debate that goes far beyond one state. Now let's break down what's actually being discussed in Virginia and why it matters. At the center of this conversation is a push to expand restrictions on where firearms can be carried, particularly in what are often called sensitive places. These can include government buildings, public events, certain public spaces, and areas where large groups gather. On the surface, that may sound straightforward, but in practice, these proposals can significantly reshape how lawful carry works day to day, because this isn't just about owning a firearm. It's about where you can have it, how you can carry it, and under what exact conditions. In my legal analysis, location-based restrictions are one of the most complex and high-risk areas of firearm law, not because people intend to violate them, but because they are easy to misunderstand. Now let's step back and look at the historical context. Virginia has gone through multiple phases when it comes to firearm regulation. At times, laws have leaned more permissive. At other times, there has been a push toward tighter controls, especially in response to public safety concerns and political shifts. And this back and forth is not unique to Virginia. It reflects a broader national trend where firearm policy evolves over time, sometimes expanding rights, sometimes refining or limiting them. Now, from a constitutional perspective, the Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. But it's important to understand something clearly. That right, while fundamental, is not unlimited. The Supreme Court has repeatedly acknowledged that certain restrictions are permissible, particularly in locations considered sensitive. There is a strong constitutional argument that governments have the authority to regulate firearms in places like schools, courthouses, and similar environments. But here's where things become more complex. Recent Supreme Court decisions have emphasized that any new restrictions should be consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. In other words, courts would likely examine whether a proposed restriction is similar to regulations that existed and were accepted in earlier periods of American history. If it is not, that raises constitutional questions. And those questions don't always have immediate answers. Because even if a law is challenged, it may remain in effect while courts review it. Which means, from a practical standpoint, lawful gun owners must navigate the law as it exists right now, not as it might be interpreted later. Now let's talk about how this intersects with federal and state authority. The United States operates under a dual legal system. Federal law sets a foundation. States build on top of it. So, while the Second Amendment provides a baseline protection, states like Virginia have the power to define additional rules within their jurisdiction. That's why something that feels broadly protected at a constitutional level can still be restricted in specific contexts at the state level. And this is where confusion often begins, because the general right may remain intact, but the conditions around that right become more detailed. Now let's bring this into real-world impact. What does this actually mean for a lawful gun owner? It means that everyday decisions become more legally sensitive. Where you go, where you stop, what type of property you enter. All of these factors can determine whether you are within the law. In my legal analysis, the biggest risk is not intentional wrongdoing. It's unintentional non-compliance. It's the moment where someone believes they are acting legally, but misses a specific restriction tied to location. And the law often does not require intent to enforce consequences. If a restriction exists and it is violated, the legal system focuses on the violation itself. Now let's briefly consider Fourth Amendment implications. If a person is suspected of carrying in a restricted area, law enforcement may initiate a stop or inquiry. Courts would likely examine whether that interaction was justified, whether there was reasonable suspicion based on the circumstances. If not, there could be grounds to challenge the legality of the search or seizure. But if the underlying violation is clear, such as being in a prohibited location, those protections may not prevent the case from moving forward. The Fifth Amendment also becomes relevant during these interactions. People often underestimate how quickly a simple conversation can turn into a legal issue. Statements made voluntarily, even with good intentions, can later be used as evidence. In my legal analysis, awareness of procedural rights is just as important as understanding the law itself. Now let's address the political reality behind proposals like this. Firearm regulation is one of the most debated issues in the United States. Supporters of expanded restrictions often argue that limiting firearms in certain public areas reduces risk and enhances safety. And from a policy perspective, that argument is taken seriously. On the other hand, critics argue that expanding no-carry zones can make the law more confusing and place an additional burden on individuals who are trying to comply. There is a strong constitutional argument that laws must be clear and not overly broad, so that an ordinary person can reasonably understand what is permitted. Courts would likely examine whether these proposals strike the right balance between public safety and constitutional protections. And that balance is not always easy to achieve. Now think about the long-term implications. Legal systems rarely change overnight in obvious ways. Instead, they evolve gradually. A new restriction here, an expanded definition there, a shift in enforcement practices. Individually, each change may seem manageable, but over time they can significantly reshape how a right is exercised in everyday life. In my legal analysis, the long-term trend points toward increasing complexity. Not necessarily the removal of rights, but the addition of conditions. And with more conditions comes a higher responsibility to stay informed. Now bring this back to a practical level. If you are a lawful gun owner, what matters most is not just knowing that you have a right. It's understanding the boundaries of that right in real-world situations. Because the legal system does not evaluate what you believed. It evaluates what you did within the framework of the law. And that framework can change, sometimes clearly, sometimes quietly. So the safest approach is not assumption. It's verification. It's staying updated. It's understanding where the law applies differently. It's recognizing that small details can have serious consequences. Take a moment and ask yourself, are you fully updated on the laws that apply to you right now? Or are you relying on what you think you know? Because that gap, that difference between assumption and reality, is where most legal problems begin. This isn't about fear. It's about awareness. It's about recognizing that rights and responsibilities exist together, and that staying informed is one of the most effective ways to protect yourself within the law. So, as this situation continues to develop, keep your focus where it belongs, on understanding, on responsibility, and on staying within clearly defined legal boundaries. Because in a system that continues to evolve, the people who stay informed are the ones who stay protected. If you found this breakdown valuable, stay engaged in the discussion in a respectful and thoughtful way. Share your perspective in the comments. What do you think about expanding restricted areas, and how should the law balance clarity with safety? Make sure you subscribe, press the bell icon, and stay connected for more clear, professional, and legally grounded updates. Because, at the end of the day, understanding the law isn't just about knowing your rights, it's about knowing exactly how to protect them. Now let's take this even further, because understanding the proposal is one thing, but understanding how it actually plays out in real life is where the real risk and clarity begins. Picture a completely ordinary day. You're running errands. You stop at a public location. Nothing unusual, nothing intentional. But what many people don't realize is that under proposals like this, the legal classification of certain places can expand in ways that aren't immediately obvious. A location that once allowed lawful carry may now fall under a restricted category, and the difference isn't always clearly marked in a way that the average person would notice. In my legal analysis, this is one of the most significant challenges with expanding sensitive place restrictions. It's not just the rule itself, it's how clearly that rule is communicated and understood. Courts would likely examine whether a reasonable person could identify the restriction. Was it clearly defined? Was it properly communicated? Was there fair notice? Because under constitutional principles, especially those tied to due process, laws are expected to be clear enough that ordinary individuals can follow them without guesswork. There is a strong constitutional argument that when laws become too vague or overly broad, they risk creating exactly the kind of confusion that leads to unintentional violations. And that brings us to enforcement. Because even the clearest law still depends on how it is applied. In real-world situations, enforcement is not always uniform. Two individuals in similar situations may experience very different outcomes, depending on the circumstances, the interpretation of the officer, and the specifics of the environment. One might receive a warning, another might face formal charges, and that inconsistency is not necessarily a flaw. It's a reflection of how discretionary systems operate. But for the average person, it introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty increases risk. Now consider how quickly a situation can escalate. An interaction begins as a routine inquiry. A question is asked, a clarification is needed. At that point, everything still feels manageable. But then details start to matter. Are you within a restricted area? Are there posted signs? Is the event or location temporarily designated as sensitive? These are not questions people usually ask themselves in everyday life. But legally, they can define the entire outcome. In my legal analysis, the majority of issues in these cases are not about intent. They're about technical compliance, and technical compliance requires precision. Now let's connect this to a broader constitutional discussion. Recent Supreme Court decisions have placed significant emphasis on historical tradition when evaluating firearm regulations. That means courts are not just asking whether a law serves a modern purpose. They are also asking whether similar restrictions existed historically. Courts would likely examine whether expanded sensitive place designations align with historical examples like courthouses, legislative assemblies, or polling places. If the expansion goes beyond those traditional categories, it may raise constitutional questions. But again, and this is critical, those questions are resolved over time, not instantly. So while legal challenges may exist, individuals are still expected to comply with the law as it is currently enforced. And that gap between legal debate and real-world enforcement is where many people misunderstand their position. Now let's talk about private property, because this adds another layer that is often overlooked. Even without government-imposed restrictions, private property owners may set their own rules regarding firearms. These rules can be enforced through trespassing laws. So someone may believe they are within their constitutional rights, but if they remain on property where firearms are not permitted, they may still face legal consequences. Courts would likely examine whether proper notice was given and whether the individual complied when informed. And again, this has less to do with constitutional rights and more to do with property law. But the outcome, for the individual, is still very real. Now consider the practical consequences. What happens if someone unknowingly violates one of these restrictions? In many cases, it doesn't end with a simple correction. It can involve citations, legal proceedings, and long-term implications that affect a person's record. And in some situations, even a minor violation can create complications for future licensing or legal standing. In my legal analysis, this is why awareness is not just helpful, it's essential. Because once a situation escalates into a legal matter, the options available to resolve it become more limited. Prevention is always stronger than reaction. Now let's look at the political reality behind proposals like this. Legislation does not exist in a vacuum. It is influenced by public opinion, recent events, advocacy groups, and broader policy goals. Some lawmakers support expanding restrictions as a way to increase safety in public spaces. Others express concern about overregulation and the potential impact on lawful individuals. There is a strong constitutional argument on both sides, which is why these proposals often face intense debate. Courts would likely play a central role if such measures are challenged, especially if there are claims that they go beyond historical or constitutional limits. But whether a proposal passes or not depends on multiple factors: political composition, public pressure, and legislative priorities. So from a practical standpoint, uncertainty remains until a final decision is made, and during that uncertainty, awareness becomes even more important. Now step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. This is not just about one proposal in one state. It reflects a broader shift toward more detailed and condition-based regulation. Not necessarily eliminating rights, but defining them more precisely. And with precision comes complexity. In my legal analysis, the long-term implication is clear. The legal environment is becoming more layered, more detailed, more dependent on context, which means individuals must also become more informed and more precise in how they operate within it. So, what does that mean for you? It means that relying on general knowledge is no longer enough. It means understanding not just what is allowed, but where, when, and under what conditions. It means recognizing that small details can have significant consequences. And most importantly, it means staying updated in a system that continues to evolve. Take a moment and think about how easily assumptions can form. I've always been allowed to do this. I've done this before, without any issue. But the law does not operate on past experience. It operates on current rules. And those rules can change. So as this conversation continues, keep your focus on clarity. Not fear, not frustration, but clarity. Because in a legal system like this, clarity is what keeps you on the right side of the line. And without it, even responsible actions can lead to unintended outcomes. Stay aware, stay informed, and approach this topic with the level of attention it deserves. Because the difference between being safe and being at risk is often not what you do. It's what you don't realize has changed. Now let's go even deeper, because understanding the law in theory is one thing, but understanding its practical consequences is where most lawful gun owners find themselves facing real challenges. Imagine walking into your daily routine. Maybe it's work, maybe it's running errands, maybe it's attending a public event. You're confident you know where you can and cannot carry. You've followed the rules, you've trained responsibly, and you've never had an issue. Then suddenly, a change takes effect. A new restriction, a newly defined, sensitive place that wasn't there before. And without clear signage, without an obvious warning, you could be technically in violation, without even realizing it. In my legal analysis, this is one of the most critical issues with location-based restrictions. They don't always announce themselves in ways that are easy to notice, and courts would likely examine whether the restriction was sufficiently clear to an ordinary person. Ambiguity can create risk, even for the most responsible individuals. This is also where the Fifth Amendment becomes practically relevant. During a routine stop, any statements you make about carrying, your knowledge of the law, or your intentions could be used as evidence. Courts would likely examine whether a person understood the restriction and whether any statements were voluntary. The safest approach, in my legal opinion, is always to remain calm, respectful, and aware of your procedural rights without volunteering unnecessary information. Now let's consider the balance between public safety and constitutional rights. Supporters of expanded restrictions argue that restricting firearms in certain areas reduces potential dangers and protects communities. That is a legitimate concern, and courts typically give weight to public safety objectives. At the same time, there is a strong constitutional argument that such laws must be narrowly tailored. Overly broad restrictions can infringe on the Second Amendment and create confusion for lawful gun owners trying to comply with the law. Courts would likely weigh historical precedent, public interest, and constitutional protections when reviewing challenges. But while the legal debates unfold, the immediate reality falls on individual gun owners. You cannot rely on potential court interpretations to protect yourself in the moment. Compliance is required with the law as it exists today, and that means understanding not only where you can carry, but under what circumstances, on what type of property, and during which events. The practical consequences of non-compliance can range from minor citations to more serious legal proceedings. Even an unintentional violation can affect licensing, future permits, or legal records. In my legal analysis, the long-term implications are often underestimated. A single incident, seemingly small, can ripple outward, affecting opportunities, reputation, and legal standing for years. It is also important to note the federal versus state dynamic. While the Second Amendment sets a baseline, states like Virginia have authority to impose additional restrictions, particularly in the context of sensitive locations. This dual-layered system can create confusion, but it also reinforces the importance of staying updated on state-specific laws. Courts would likely examine how state restrictions interact with federal rights, but in day-to-day life, compliance depends on knowing the state's specific rules. Now consider how quickly these changes can take effect. A law may pass, be signed, and become enforceable in a matter of weeks. Awareness often lags behind implementation, and legally, ignorance of the law is not a defense. That gap between enactment and public understanding is precisely where risk emerges. So what does this mean for a responsible gun owner? It means that ongoing education is essential. It means that assumptions based on past experience are no longer sufficient. It means that every routine interaction, entering a building, attending an event, even crossing a street, requires awareness of current regulations. And finally, think about the broader trend. Over time, firearm regulations are evolving. not necessarily to eliminate rights, but to define them more precisely. As regulations become more detailed and context-dependent, lawful gun owners must adapt accordingly. In my legal analysis, the long-term implication is clear. Staying informed, verifying current rules, and exercising caution are not optional. They are the most effective means of legal protection. Take a moment to reflect. How confident are you that your understanding of current carry laws is fully up to date? Are you relying on assumptions or on verified information? That difference between what you think you know and what the law actually requires is exactly where most legal problems begin. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know, do you think these expanded sensitive place restrictions will make public spaces safer, or do they create more confusion for lawful gun owners? Your perspective matters, and your engagement helps shape an informed discussion. And remember, stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe, press the bell icon, and follow this channel for the next updates where we'll continue to break down laws that impact your rights and responsibilities as a gun owner. Because understanding the law isn't just about knowing your rights, it's about knowing exactly how to protect them responsibly. Now let's bring all of this into perspective, because understanding the law and its practical effects is only half the battle. The other half is knowing how to navigate it responsibly, day by day. Think about your routines. Every time you step into a store, attend a public event, or even walk past a government building, you're interacting with laws that may have shifted in ways you haven't noticed. The most responsible gun owners are often those who anticipate these changes, not react to them. In my legal analysis, preparation and knowledge are the strongest forms of protection, far stronger than relying on luck or assumptions. It's also important to recognize that while legal debates happen in courts and legislative chambers, your personal responsibility is immediate. Courts would likely examine both the letter of the law and historical precedent, but while that process unfolds, compliance depends entirely on you. Knowing where, when, and how restrictions apply is what keeps you within the law. Long-term, this is more than just a single proposal in Virginia. It's a reflection of a trend across the country. Laws are becoming increasingly context-dependent, with specific conditions tied to locations, events, and situations. That means lawful gun owners must also become more informed, more precise, and more proactive in understanding the rules. Now, let's take a practical view. What can you do right now to stay protected? First, verify your knowledge with credible, up-to-date sources. Don't rely on what you've always assumed. Second, be aware of signage, posted restrictions, and communications about sensitive areas. Third, recognize that small details can carry significant consequences. Where you carry and how you carry matters legally. And while some may view this as restrictive, there is also value in understanding the rationale behind these laws. Supporters argue that certain restrictions enhance public safety and reduce risk in crowded or vulnerable locations. Acknowledging their perspective helps frame the debate rationally and strengthens your own understanding of where rights and responsibilities intersect. At the same time, there is a strong constitutional argument that restrictions must be clear and narrowly tailored. Courts would likely examine whether any new regulation aligns with historical practices and whether it respects the core protections guaranteed under the Second Amendment. In my legal opinion, this balance is essential to maintain both public safety and individual rights. Ultimately, the takeaway is this: awareness, education, and responsibility are the best tools a lawful gun owner has. The law evolves, and while you cannot control every legislative outcome, you can control how well-informed and prepared you are. Acting responsibly, knowing the boundaries, and verifying current regulations are what separate a safe, compliant gun owner from one at risk. So before we end, I want to hear from you. Comment below. What topic should we cover in the next video? Do you want a deep dive into constitutional rights, state-specific laws, or real-world case examples? Your input helps guide this channel and ensures we cover what matters most to you. Make sure to subscribe, press the bell icon, and stay connected for more professional, clear, and legally grounded updates. Because understanding the law isn't just about knowledge. It's about protecting yourself and making informed, responsible decisions every day. Remember, the difference between risk and safety isn't luck. It's clarity. Stay informed, stay responsible, and stay one step ahead.